Good afternoon, and welcome to What It Is and What It Isn't. Today is our first episode. Your host here is John Kelbley. Today we will be talking about sources and using sources in your papers, how to determine if a source is primary, secondary, what type of source it is, and if it is credible or not. So the first thing we're talking about is types of sources. Okay, so there are three main types of sources. There's academic, popular, and tertiary sources. Okay, so an academic source comes from a field and it's meant for that specific discourse community. If you want to understand more of what a discourse community is, look at my first multimodal project and it'll explain what a discourse community is. So one example of this would be this Engineering Skills for Career Success textbook. Right? So this was written by professionals for students in that class. So that would make it an academic resource, right? Because you're using it academically. Another example of academic resources would be a professional journal written by professionals for professionals to read and look over. We'll get more into the looking over part when we talk about if it's credible or not credible of a source. The second kind of source that we are talking about today is popular. Now, popular source it's written so anyone can read it. You don't have to be a specific person to understand it. Like an academic journal, there's going to be language in there that not everyone's going to understand. A really easy way to see a popular source is to tell. So, like, if you can read it and understand it and you are not a part of that community and don't know their slang, that is a popular source. One example of a popular source would be Time Magazine. You don't have to be an expert to understand what they're talking about in Time Magazine. Another would be National Geographic. Okay, so the third source that we have is tertiary. Now, tertiary you kind of want to stay away from in your papers as much as possible. Tertiaries are lists and indexes of specific information. So it would be an encyclopedia or a dictionary. Would be a very simple way to put a tertiary source. Okay. Now, with all three of these sources, they can either be primary or secondary sources. So what would be a secondary source for academic? Well, an academic secondary source would be, example would be, okay, so you have a journal and somebody reviews your journal and then writes about your journal that you wrote, they'd be a secondary source. So the primary source would be your journal. The secondary source would be their opinion on your journal. And these are called opinion editorials. So they're op-eds. Those are always going to be a secondary source because they're writing about something else that's happening. Primary source is always firsthand. So what would be a popular primary source? Okay, if there's something live going on and the news crew is at the scene recording it and reporting on it as it was happening, that's a primary source. Now, a secondary source is if a week later some more information came to light and they found out the news crew misreported while they were there and someone wrote their opinion on what they think actually happened at the place, but they weren't there. They were just looking at all the information now that's come out, and they wrote their article. That'd be a secondary source because it was through other sources. That's how I like to think of secondary sources, a source through a source. Now, how do you determine if it is credible or not? If your source is credible and if you should use it in your paper. An easy way to determine if it's credible or not for academic is if it's been reviewed. So, some of the textbooks I have 4 or 5 authors, and they've all reviewed, gone through the textbook, and found and clarified, made sure all the information was right. In our online textbook, I'll have a link below to that textbook. It was written by two authors, and both authors peer-reviewed each other. That made it more credible, right? Correct? So like a non-credible source would be like it really depends. So if you were writing on a book like Everyone Brave is Forgiven, and you're writing your opinion on that book, then it would be a credible source. But if you were so a little background on this book. This book is a book about a teacher in World War II, in London. So if you were writing on fictional books written about World War II, this would be a credible source because it's a fictional book written about World War II. But if you were writing on the history of World War II, this would not be a credible source because it's not an actual history book. This is all fictional. So you want to get information that is relevant to make it credible for what you are writing about. If I'm taking this engineering skills and career success book and I'm trying to apply this to an English book, it's not going to be a credible source because there's nothing I can use in it. Some sources are harder to find. Some uncredible sources are harder to tell than others, and that comes in when you talk about bias. Now, bias really depends on where you go. So it's like CNN versus Fox. Fox is known to be a very right conservative reporting group. CNN is a very left liberal reporting group. There's going to be bias in both groups, and you're going to have to be able to tell how much bias is in that article. Sometimes, if it's a really heated topic, neither of them are going to be good sources to you. So I hope this video helps. Check it out. What it is, what it isn't.